Okay, let's dive in. We're starting this one in a pretty unique spot. Picture a Tim Hortons
Mm.
in Edmonton.
Right, you got that, that familiar smell of coffee, Timbits.
Exactly. And just the regular chatter, maybe about hockey, maybe about gas prices.
The usual morning buzz.
Then things take a turn. Prime Minister Mark Carney is there just having coffee with Rick Mercer, and they're talking Trump's tariffs. Seems normal enough, I guess.
Well, that's the kind of thing people were talking about, sure. But setting it there in that very Canadian place,
Yeah.
it makes what happens next kind of stand out.
Totally. Because suddenly, US Senator Ted Cruz walks in. And it's pretty obvious he's not just there for a double-double.
No, well, it sounds like it was planned as a confrontation about those tariffs.
Right. So that's our deep dive today. We're going to unpack this whole encounter. What were the arguments? What does it tell us about, trade, pride, economic muscle?
And we're working from excerpts that detail this pretty heated exchange, right? All happening over coffee and donuts.
Yeah, exactly. It's just fascinating how this, local coffee shop suddenly becomes the stage for these big U.S.-Canada tensions.
The setting is almost a character itself. But, Tim Hortons, the Maple Leaf flag probably somewhere, it screams Canada.
Absolutely. So you've got the scene set. Carney and Mercer are talking, and Mercer's basically asking, in his way, are we going to push back on these U.S. tariffs?
And Carney, he doesn't really hesitate. He starts listing the counter tariffs Canada had already put on things like American steel.
Bourbon, yeah, and farm stuff.
And he specifically mentions the hit to states like Ohio and Kentucky. So not just a general response, but a targeted one.
Strategic. And right then, boom, Senator Cruz makes his entrance.
Doesn't sound like he's into it either.
Not at all. Walks up to Carney, makes some comment about, a PM in a coffee shop, and then immediately goes for it, says Canada's weak without the U.S.
Wow, straight for the jugular. That's a pretty aggressive opening gambit. Sets a tone.
But Mercer jumps right in, apparently with some quip about Cruz being from Calgary originally, but leaving young, questioning his connection to Canada now.
Classic Mercer. Using that sharp wit to kind of deflate the tension or at least push back immediately. Very Canadian response in a way.
It really is. And that brings us straight to the core economic arguments. Cruz kicks off saying Trump's tariffs are, about protecting American jobs.
The standard justification we heard a lot back then.
And he claims Canada's economy is taking a hit because of it. I think he threw out a number like exports down 2%.
Right, trying to paint a picture of Canadian weakness. But Carney's counter is immediate.
Yeah, he doesn't really argue the export number directly, does he? He pivots.
Exactly. He pivots to Canada's own tariffs and how they're hurting those specific U.S. states, Ohio, Kentucky. Mentions job losses there, bourbon sales dropping.
So making it clear it's a two-way street. Pain on both sides.
And Carney goes further, right? He talks about diversification.
Yeah, bringing up the CETA deal with Europe and those agreements, MOUs, with Japan and the UK on the AI hub.
Trying to show Canada isn't just sitting back, that it's building other bridges.
But Cruz kind of waves that away, doesn't he?
But yeah, basically saying, look, 70% of your stuff still comes to us. That other stuff is like peanuts. He hammers that dependence angle.
Seems like a key part of his argument, you need us.
But Carney pushes back with actual numbers on the EU trade growth since CETA. And he talks up the future value of the tech sector, the AI stuff.
So arguing that, yeah, the U.S. market is big, but these other avenues are real and growing. It's not just about the U.S. anymore.
Then Cruz tries a different angle, claiming Canada's overall GDP was shrinking. Using that big macro number to suggest the whole economy struggling.
And that's when Mercer jumps back in.
Yeah, with a really sharp point about inflation in the U.S. Wow. Car prices going up there.
Right, linking it directly to the American tariffs. Sort of a, hey, look in the mirror moment.
Exactly. And Carney then doubles down on the idea that Canada's tariffs weren't random. They were surgically targeted.
Aimed right at those U.S. swing states, adding that political layer to it.
It definitely shows a level of calculation, not just pure reaction.
Okay, so the economic jabs are flying, but then Cruz shifts gears, right? Starts talking domestic Canadian issues.
Yeah, points to Canada's inflation rate. I think it's 3.8%.
Yeah.
And specifically mentions rising housing costs right there in Edmonton, like 20% up.
And uses that to question Carney's leadership, trying to connect the trade fight to struggles people are feeling at home.
It's a common political tactic, but Carney tackles it head on.
He acknowledges the housing problem, which is, smart. You can't deny it.
Right, and then he lays out the government's plan. Building 2 million new homes, cutting red tape for permits, construction jobs, help for first-time buyers.
trying to show they have a strategy, they're not ignoring it.
But Cruz dismisses it, calls the plans inadequate, basically, and goes back to hammering the GDP growth issue. That seems to be his main attack point on the economy.
And Mercer throws in that comment about the Texas power grid.
Yeah, a bit of whataboutism maybe, but also a pointed reminder that, Cruz's home state has had its own major domestic issues. No one's perfect.
Then comes a really pivotal moment, according to the source. Someone from the crowd, a retired teacher, speaks up.
And asks Carney directly, what about inflation? How does it affect regular people like us?
Brings it right down to earth, takes it out of the abstract numbers game.
Absolutely. Forces Carney to connect policy to everyday life. And his response focuses on things like clean energy investments meant to lower costs eventually, tax credits, freezing federal fees.
Trying to offer concrete examples of help.
But Cruz just calls it a Band-Aid, sticks to his criticism.
Though Carney and Mercer apparently fire back pretty effectively there, pointing to actual clean energy job creation in Alberta.
Right, contrasting positive developments in Alberta with Cruz's own record and the policies he supports, turning the criticism around on him.
It really shows the different approaches Cruz on the big negative numbers, Carney trying to balance that with specific initiatives and future plans.
Then the whole thing shifts again and maybe gets even more intense. Mercer brings up Trump's old 51st state comment.
Oh, yeah, that always touches a nerve, straight to sovereignty.
And Cruz's response sounds pretty condescending. Calling Canada a junior partner, saying it relies on the U.S. for markets, for security, brings up NATO spending.
Basically playing the little brother card.
Pretty much. But Carney comes back strong, defends Canada's independence, going way back to 1867, talks up Canada's role in NATO, leading in the Arctic NORAD investment.
And stresses that the trade relationship makes both countries stronger. It's mutual.
And Mercer chimes in again with that crucial local point, Alberta's oil. How much the U.S. relies on it.
Yeah, it kind of flips the dependency narrative right there. Who needs whom?
But Cruz just doubles down, calls Canada America's backyard.
Wow, that's blunt. And pretty disrespectful.
Yeah. Extremely. And Carney calls him out on it, saying he's forgotten Alberta's soul, its economic weight, the oil, the GDP contribution.
Really connecting it back to the place they're actually in and challenging Cruz's whole attitude.
And the crowd's reaction, chanting Canada, that says a lot.
Yeah, that shows how much that comment crossed a line. It stopped being just a debate.
It became about national pride, absolutely.
Okay, so then we get into what feels like the economic power play section. Cruz tries to brush off Canada's tariffs again, calling them a tantrum because, the U.S. economy is so much bigger.
Size matters, basically. That's his argument.
And Mercer has that line about Canadians being tough, like enduring winter.
Yeah, another classic Canadian deflection, using humor and resilience imagery.
But Carney gets serious. He repeats how the tariffs are hurting specific U.S. sectors, and then he drops the possibility of Canada selling its U.S. bond holdings.
That's not a small thing. That's potentially hitting the U.S. financial system.
And Cruz's reaction, he seemed genuinely alarmed.
Apparently, yes. It shows that even with the size difference, Canada does have levers it could potentially pull that would get Washington's attention.
Carney then follows up, talking again about tech exports growing, global partnerships. Basically saying Canada's charting its own course, reshaping global trade.
Not just America's backyard is the message.
And Mercer adds that line about Canada shaking Wall Street. A bit dramatic, maybe, but emphasizes the potential impact.
It plays up the idea that Canada has more clout than Cruz gives it credit for.
Cruz tries to downplay it again. U.S. economy is huge, etc. But Carney keeps bringing it back to the targeted tariffs in swing states and Alberta's oil. Specific points of leverage.
And Mercer's surgery analogy for the tariffs, small tool, precise cuts, can still cause significant pain. It's a good visual.
Then the gloves really come off. It turns personal. Cruz attacks Carney directly.
Calls him a globalist, says he abandoned Canada, questions if he understands what ordinary people are going through with inflation, rent.
Basically the out-of-touch elite attack.
Yeah, it often happens when substantive arguments run dry. But Carney defends himself pretty robustly.
Points to his record during the 2008 crisis, stabilizing markets in the UK.
And then contrasts it sharply with Cruz leaving Alberta and supporting tariffs that arguably hurt the very people Cruz used to represent. Ouch.
That's a direct hit. turning the who represents who argument right back at him.
And Mercer piles on, mocking Cruz for lecturing Canadians on patriotism after leaving.
Cruz tries to insist he's still connected to Alberta, talking oil prices and jobs.
But Mercer challenges that, asking where he was during previous tough times in Alberta, questioning his actual track record for the province.
Carney then reinforces his points about clean energy jobs growing in Alberta, the housing plans, setting up a contrast between his government's actions and the impact of U.S. policies Cruz backed.
Presenting it as investing in Alberta's future versus policies that harm it.
And Mercer gets the last jab in that round, suggesting Cruz is too busy with Trump to fight for anyone and should try a double-double.
Yeah, implying he's forgotten basic Canadiana. It seems the personal attacks really didn't land well for Cruz.
Which leads us to the absolute final straw, Cruz's parting shot.
Declaring Canada a province of America with empty dreams.
Yeah. You can just picture the reaction. The source mentions specific people, an oil worker, a woman in a parka, students all just erupting.
Utterly dismissive, completely insulting. It clearly ignited something visceral in everyone there.
Mercer tells him to go find a Starbucks in Texas. Perfect dismissal.
Cuts right through it. Basically saying you don't belong here after saying that.
And Carney delivers this powerful statement about Canada's strength, unity, economic contribution, and basically tells Cruz to get out.
Channels the crowd's anger, takes a stand.
And the crowd starts chanting out. It's a complete rejection.
Even Cruz's last gasp about Canada regretting this gets shut down instantly by Mercer reminding him about Alberta's oil keeping U.S. gas stations running.
And that final line from the oil worker, Calgary doesn't claim you. That's got to sting if you're originally from there.
Absolutely seals it. He leaves in disgrace, apparently.
And the scene ends with cheers, Carney calling for unity, and Mercer's final line about, well, don't mess with Canada in a Tim Hortons.
It's an incredible arc for what started as a coffee meeting. Shows the power of that shared identity when it feels attacked.
And this whole thing blew up in the media, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Canadian outlets, CBC, Globe and Mail, National Post, mostly framed it as Carney standing up for Canada, defending national pride against, well, an insulting attack. And they definitely highlighted the Cruz leaving Alberta angle.
And the U.S. reaction.
More mixed, as you'd expect. The New York Times talked about the strain on relations. Fox News defended Cruz, painted Carney as, the out-of-touch globalist figure.
Shows how the same event gets filtered through different political lenses.
Not that way. But in Canada, the dominant feeling seemed to be one of rallying together. It really struck a chord.
So when you boil it all down, this Tim Hortons showdown, it wasn't just political theater. It really did tap into something deep about Canadian pride, about resilience.
Yeah, and Carney's performance, sticking to facts, but also showing that determination, clearly resonated.
And Mercer's role shouldn't be underestimated either, using that humor to disarm and unify.
It really highlighted that strength can come from standing together, finding common ground against something perceived as an outside insult.
It just shows how unity can sometimes overcome these big challenges or perceived slights.
A really potent mix of economics, politics, and raw national feeling.
So this deep dive, starting in a coffee shop, really uncovered a lot about Canadian identity and economic resolve. It leaves us with a thought, doesn't it? When you see that kind of deep-seated national pride flare up alongside these sharp economic arguments playing out so publicly, what does an incident like this really signal for the future of the U.S.-Canada relationship, especially around trade and diplomacy?
Right, and maybe it also makes you wonder, what other ordinary places, seemingly mundane spots, could suddenly become the stage for these kinds of significant national moments? Where else might these tensions or expressions of identity play out unexpectedly? Definitely something to think about.